compensated for King's influence. Ernest King was born in Lorain, Ohio in 1878 and was old enough to have served in the Spanish-American War of 1898. He served in a wide variety of posts and built up experience in gunnery, torpedo boats, mining operations, and submarines. King also commanded ships and squadrons, as was the normal career pattern for senior naval officers at the time. Unlike some of his British colleagues during the Atlantic campaign, he was willing to listen to subordinates and to absorb their ideas, although in doing so he often displayed a rudeness that earned him respect but not affection in the service. King was appointed Chief of the Naval Bureau of Aeronautics in 1933 and was largely responsible for the U.S. Navy's development of naval aviation that was far in advance of anything comparable in the Royal Navy. He rose through the positions of aircraft commander in the battle fleet to commander of the U.S. Navy's patrol force. In this post, he became deeply involved in the U.S. Navy's increasing commitment to the Atlantic and became highly involved personally in the way the battle against the U-boats was being conducted. This may be the cause of his constant interference and involvement in the Atlantic theatre of operations that contrasted with his attitude to the Pacific War. In the Pacific, King chose senior officers he believed he could trust, such as Chester Nimitz, and let them get on with the job. In the Atlantic, King took personal command. Grand Admiral Erich Rieder was Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, from the beginning of the war to his resignation in 1943. He was at the helm for most of the critical period of the Battle of the Atlantic. Rieder had joined the German Navy in 1894, at the age of 18. A native of Hamburg, he'd served in the High Seas Fleet, commanding a cruiser, before his appointment as Chief of Staff to Admiral Hipper, who commanded the battle cruisers at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. Rieder was a committed conservative and German nationalist who strongly believed the Navy could play a pivotal role in restoring Germany's position and greatness during the interwar period. In 1925 he was given command of the Baltic Naval Station, and in 1928 was appointed to the post of Chief of the Naval Command. Under Rieder, the German Navy was transformed. He conceived the so-called pocket battleships, designed to get around the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. He also lay at the heart of the subterfuge that led to Germany having a fully trained and experienced submarine arm, well before the ban on German possession of submarines was revoked. Rieder also masterminded the Z Plan, in which Germany was to build a large, well-equipped fleet based on modern battleships, battlecruisers, and aircraft carriers. Unfortunately for the Germans, the Second World War came 10 years before the plan could reach fruition. Rieder realized that the main role the German Navy could play in the conflict would be the same as in World War I, disrupting enemy trade. The importance of the submarine would be critical. Rieder needed the right man for the job, so Karl Dönitz was made commander of the submarine arm. It was Rieder who urged the German High Command to introduce unrestricted submarine warfare from the beginning of the Second World War. He remembered and had learned how close such a campaign came to success in early 1917. But Hitler equally remembered how the campaign had affected neutral opinion, especially in the United States. Admiral Rieder believed the surface fleet could play an almost equally vital role, and in the early days of the war he sent the few surface warships Germany had into the Atlantic, where they enjoyed limited success. Following the loss of the Bismarck in May 1941, the major surface units of the German Navy were restricted to operations around Norway and in the Baltic. It was his continuing belief in the part the surface warship could play that led to Rieder's downfall. On the 30th of December 1942, a force of German warships, including the pocket battleship Scheer and the heavy cruiser Hipper, sailed from Altenfjord in northern Norway to intercept an Allied convoy bound for Russia. In the ensuing chaos, the German ships were beaten off by a force of British cruisers and destroyers in the Battle of the Barents Sea. This humiliation, which was partly caused by Hitler's lack of resolve on committing surface ships to action, led the Führer to order the scrapping of all the remaining surface ships. Hitler's refusal to countermand this order triggered Rieder's resignation. In an ironic twist, he was replaced as Commander-in-Chief by Karl Dönitz. More than any other leader, Karl Dönitz epitomizes the Battle of the Atlantic. Dönitz was the Commander-in-Chief of the German submarine force from its formation until his promotion to Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy in early 1943. Even then, he maintained a firm hand on his beloved U-boats, only surrendering control in name. He achieved even greater notoriety as the second Führer of National Socialist Germany after Hitler's death. It had always been intended that Dönitz should take control of the newly formed U-boat force. At the time of its formation in February 1935, Dönitz was the captain of the cruiser Emden. He was 43 years old. Born near Berlin in 1891, he joined the Imperial Navy as a cadet in 1910, graduating as an officer in 1913. When the First World War broke out, he was signals officer of the cruiser Breslau, which was operating in the Mediterranean at the time. In 1916, Dönitz was appointed to the submarine service. After serving with distinction in U-39, he was given command of UC-25 at the beginning of 1918. His reports spoke of his fine military bearing, energy, good manners, diligence, enthusiasm, popularity, and tact with both officers and men. In late 1918, Dönitz was in command of UB-68. While attacking a British convoy in October, he was forced to scuttle his submarine and surrender. His captors noted that he was sullen and introspective. He became obsessed with the loss of his ship. After undergoing psychological examination in Britain, he was repatriated soon after the armistice, but he immediately rejoined the German Navy. Dönitz survived the post-war purge of naval officers which followed the Kaputsch and decided to stay in the Navy. After 2 years as a torpedo boat commander, Dönitz joined the Torpedo and Mine Inspectorate. After a series of sea and staff jobs, he was promoted steadily until he was considered the most appropriate officer to command the new submarine force. On the 1st of October 1935, he was promoted to full captain and appointed Chief of Submarines. Germany could boast 3 small submarines at the time. He worked closely with Admiral Reeder as the new Navy began to take shape and proposed that Reeder should include 300 submarines in his Z plan. This was the minimum number Dönitz felt would be viable for any forthcoming war with Great Britain. Reeder accepted the figure. At the end of the summer of 1939, Dönitz wrote to Reeder formally expressing his fears over a war with Britain when his force was so unprepared. But he was assured by Hitler himself that no such situation would be allowed to happen. Throughout the war, Dönitz maintained a tight control over his submarines. On the fall of France, he transferred his headquarters to Brittany, where he could be closer to the front line. He was always available to welcome returning crews and maintained a high public relations profile. This was part of his campaign to keep the German people constantly informed of the successes of the U-boats, and thus secure enough resources for the force to keep expanding. This was not always easy. He found himself in constant conflict with the German Navy's biggest enemy, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe. As the war continued, Dönitz constantly developed his concept of operations to reflect the strategic changes taking place. As more U-boats became available, he identified vulnerable areas in the Allied convoy routes and targeted his forces there accordingly. As numbers increased, he introduced the Wolfpack tactics. Although he claimed they were his own invention, he had in fact learned them from his experiences in the First World War. But he certainly enhanced their operations to the point where they almost defeated Allied defensive measures. Yet Dönitz was a realist. He knew that to win the Battle of the Atlantic, his submarines had to sink Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. When in the middle of 1943, he realized that he was losing this battle, he knew that the U-boat campaign was doomed to failure. He did not give up and insisted that more and more resources be allocated to the submarine service. Despite his being the second and last Führer, albeit for only a few days, long enough to sign the German surrender, it was with some reluctance that the Allies put him on trial as a war criminal. The Battle of the Atlantic had mostly been fought within the rules of war,